Hello, everybody, and welcome to Chapter 12 of Book 3 of the Royal Ranger series, Duel at Araluen. Let's go ahead and get into it. Maddie was back at the rendezvous point by the river when the Heron arrived that afternoon. While the crew began setting up a camp among the trees, she consulted with the command team, Hal, Thorn, and Stig. I plan on going through the enemy lines tonight to get a message to my father, she told them. She had drawn a sketch of the positions of the camp and of the hill fort, and it was spread out on the ground between them. They sat in a semicircle around it. "Is that wise?" Hal said cautiously. She looked up at him. "It's necessary. The Red Fox clan are planning a surprise attack tomorrow night, and I want to warn him about it." Thorn scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Your father has no idea you're coming?" When she nodded that he was right, he continued, "Well then, aren't you taking a risk that if you go sneaking up to the fort, they'll see you and put an arrow through you? I mean, I know you're a ranger, and you can appear and disappear at will, but if you want to make contact, you'll have to reveal yourself, and you might get shot before they realize who you are." "That's assuming that you can get past the enemy sentries in the first place," Stig put in. "That won't be a problem," she said. "Their discipline is slack, and the sentries are merely going through the motions. As for getting shot by Dad's men, I don't plan on going all the way to the fort. I'll work my way halfway up the hill and shoot a message arrow into the timber frame above the gate. They'll see it tomorrow morning." There was silence as they considered her plan, all of them staring at the sketch of the hill fort and enemy camp that lay between them. Hal finally looked up, studying her appraisingly. "Well, as you keep telling us, you are a ranger, so presumably you know what you're doing," he said. She nodded acknowledgement. He was impressed by her quiet confidence. When she said she could get through the enemy lines without trouble, she wasn't boasting. It was a mere statement of fact. "There's just one point," he continued. "I'm coming with you." She opened her mouth to argue, but he cut her off. "I'm not coming up the hill with you. I'll stop here." He indicated the ridgeline behind the Red Fox camp. "I need to take a look at the ground we'll be fighting on." It was a reasonable idea, she realized, and she nodded. Hal touched the crossbow lying on the grass beside him. "Plus, I can give you cover when you're coming back out, just in case things don't go exactly to plan." "When do things ever not go according to plan?" Thorn asked innocently. They all grinned. As the old saying went, once a fight started, all plans went out the window. "I want to start up the hill after midnight," she said. "The moon will be up by then." Hal looked at her curiously. "I would have thought you'd want no moon while you were sneaking through their lines." But she shook her head briskly and indicated the sky above them. "There's a good bit of scattered cloud about today. Once the breeze gets up tonight, that'll mean a lot of shadows moving across the hill, and that'll make it easier for me to stay hidden. I won't be the only thing moving." Stig grinned at his oldest friend. "You were right," he said. "She does know what she's doing." Maddie let her gaze wander over the three cheerful Scandians. It was all very well to joke and make light of things, she thought, but there was something she wanted understood. "One final point," she said, locking eyes with Hal. "I'm in charge. When we're on your ship, I defer to you, but this is my kind of operation. This is what I'm trained for. So if I tell you to do something, do it straight away, without arguing. Clear?" "Perfectly," Hal said. She was right. On board a ship, he expected instant obedience to his orders. But tonight, they'd be in her field of expertise. Maddie smiled at him. "Good. Now we may as well try to get some rest. It'll be a long night." She paused, then added, "Can your man Edvin have a meal ready for us an hour after dark?" She knew Edvin was the cook on board Heron. Hal nodded. "You're as bad as Stig," he said. "He's always thinking of his stomach." "That's precisely what I'm doing," she told him. "An empty stomach has a tendency to rumble and growl. Not a good thing to happen when you're only a few meters from a sentry." Hal was impressed. "I wouldn't have thought of that." She smiled at him. "I was caught that way during my first-year assessment tests," she said. "It's an embarrassing way to be discovered, and you can't stop your stomach from doing it." "I certainly can't," Stig admitted. "Mine roars like an angry bear when I'm hungry." "Which is most of the time," Thorne observed. But like Hal, he was impressed by Maddie's attention to detail. The moving cloud shadows and the need for a full stomach were things he never would have thought of either. He remembered his first suspicions about this girl when they had gone hunting in the forests below Castle Araluen. There's more to her than meets the eye. He realized how right he had been. She folded up her map and put it in an inside pocket in her jerkin, then rose to her feet, dusting stray blades of grass from her knees. The Skianians followed suit, Thorne groaning softly as he rose. "Feeling your age?" Hal teased the old sea-wolf, who glared at him. "Feeling my knees is more like it," he said. "Just as well I'm not coming with you tonight. Foxes would hear them creaking from half a kilometer away." They set out around the 9th hour, making their way along the farm track Maddie had scouted earlier in the day. They walked one behind the other, with the Rangers some 3 meters in the lead. Hal paid strict attention to her hand signals, freezing in his tracks when she indicated he should do so, then continuing when she gave the all-clear. Her senses for this sort of action were more highly developed than his. She heard tiny sounds that he would never have picked up, stopped and waiting until she had identified each one, and determined that there was no danger lurking ahead of them. Once she held up a hand to stop them, then a few seconds later pointed down and to the left. Peering in the direction she indicated, he saw a large gray and white badger shoving its way through the undergrowth, regarding them with a distinctly bad-tempered expression. Used to the sounds and sights of the open ocean and the movement and surge of the waves, Hal felt out of place in the dim forest, surrounded on all sides by the sound of small creatures scurrying out of their way. But he could tell that Maddie was in her element, and he trusted her with his safety for guiding. They emerged from the trees at a wide, well-grassed meadow that sloped gently upward. From the sketch she had drawn, he knew the enemy camp would be over the crest. She paused and pointed to her nostrils. He sniffed and could smell wood smoke. He nodded, indicating that he understood her signal. Then she pressed her hand, palm down, toward the ground, and sank to her knees. Reasoning that she wanted him to do the same, he copied her movement. She began to work her way through the long grass, moving at surprising speed and making virtually no sound whatsoever. He followed her, moving more clumsily and slowly. She glanced back and saw he was falling behind, so she reduced her pace, allowing him to catch up. He realized that she was staying low in case the enemy had posted sentries on the ridgeline. There had been none there earlier in the day, she had told them, but the enemy might have grown more cautious once night fell. In any event, it made sense to assume that they might have. Hal continued slowly up the hill, glancing left to right along the crest. Then he remembered her instructions, issued before they left camp. Don't look up. Your face will reflect the moonlight, and they'll see you more easily. Hurriedly, he dropped his gaze and lowered his face, crawling upward, intent on the ground directly in front of him. If there was a sentry there, Maddie would see him, and her face was obscured by the deep cowl on her cloak. But there was no guard positioned on the crest. He frowned, The enemy were obviously overconfident, and none too efficient. That was all to the good, he thought. It would make them all the more susceptible to panic when they were attacked unexpectedly from behind. He heard a low hiss and looked up cautiously. The crest was only a few meters away, and Maddie had sunk to the ground, crawling on her belly for the remaining distance. He copied her, dragging himself forward through the grass on his elbows until he was lying prone beside her, peering down at the enemy camp. Her sketch had been surprisingly accurate, he saw. The tents were pitched haphazardly at the bottom of the slope, forming an untidy huddle, dotted here and there with the red glow of campfires. To one side, closer to the small creek that ran through the bottom of the shallow valley, there was a group of 4 larger pavilions. Presumably, these belonged to the commanders of the army. Several of them were lit from within by lanterns, even at this late hour. The light glowed through their canvas sides. A sentry stood outside one of them, slouching under the front awning, a spear in one hand. Hal touched Maddie's elbow and pointed, then mouthed the word "Commander" in her direction. She nodded her understanding, then she held up her hand to him, palm outward, in an obvious signal. "Stay here." He nodded in turn, and after waiting several more seconds, she slid on her belly over the crest and began to snake her way down through the knee-high grass, angling off to the east and away from the command tents. That made sense, he thought. The Foxes would tend to keep a closer watch around their officers' tents. He tried to watch her progress, but after she had gone 20 meters or so, he lost sight of her as a moving bank of cloud shadow drifted across the hill. Several minutes later, he thought he saw a slight movement farther down the hill, but couldn't be sure if it was her or not. He shook his head in admiration. She was good at this. Moving silently, Maddie snaked her way down the hill, aiming to the right-hand side of the cluster of tents. She paused every 20 meters or so to survey the ground ahead of her, and gradually picked out the sentries on patrol. There were 6 in all, moving slowly back and forth on beats along the base of the hill, with the ground flattened out before beginning to rise once more to the fort. None of them seemed too alert, and all of them were looking up the other hill, toward the fort. Naturally, that was the direction from which they were expecting danger to come. She slipped across the shallow stream at the base of the valley. It was only 3 meters wide and 20 centimeters deep, but on her belly she was thoroughly soaked. She sensed movement to her left and slid her eyes sideways. One of the sentries had deviated from the path he had been following so far, and moved across the creek, angling upward toward the first terrace of the path that wound up to the fort. He would pass close by her current position, she saw. Slowly, she lowered her head and lay still, her body and legs concealed in the long grass, covered by the cloak. She could hear his boots swishing in the long grass now. He was only a few meters away. All I need is for him to tread on my hand, she thought bitterly, pressing her face into the soft, wet grass, willing him to move on. The swishing footsteps stopped, almost beside her, and for a dreadful moment she thought he had spotted her. Then she heard him yawn, and she relaxed. A yawning man was not an alert one. All of a sudden, she had a terrible urge to yawn as well. She fought it down, clenching her teeth until her jaws ached. Then, finally, the sentry moved away, and she felt the tension drain out of her. When she sensed he was at least 10 meters away, she allowed herself to succumb to the yawning reflex, but managed to stifle any sound as she did so. Yawning, she thought. That was something she had never considered. Maybe all sentries should be taught to yawn from time to time. the man continued to move away from her, and she resumed her uphill progress, moving faster as he disappeared around the curvature of the hill. She slid on her belly onto the first terrace, formed by the spiraling track. There was less cover here. The track had been constructed from rammed earth and small stones, and the long grass on the face of the hill didn't grow as thickly here. Waiting for a cloud shadow to pass over her, she scurried across the bare track and onto the next slope, huddling down among the sheltering grass once more. The track formed 5 levels, or steps, as it spiraled around the hill, and she planned to go up to just beyond the 3rd level. Measuring distances that afternoon, she had judged it to be about 8 meters from the fort itself, an easy distance for her bow. But the shot would be uphill, and it would be difficult to judge accurately in this uncertain light. She continued up the slope, waiting for cloud cover before she crossed the track and worked her way upward. She began to angle across to the left, to bring her more in line with the gateway above her. She had started on the extreme right-hand side of the hill. She reached the 3rd level, crossed the track, and slipped back into the cover of the long grass. She paused for a second or two, then rolled on her back, surveying the hill below her and the enemy camp, ensuring that none of the sentries were looking in her direction. When she rose to her feet to shoot, she would have the dark green mass of the hillside behind her, so she wouldn't be obvious to those below. But the movement might draw attention, and she wanted to be sure she wasn't being observed. Still on her back, she slowly loosened the fastening of her cloak and shrugged out of it. Her bow was slung across her left shoulder below it, and she unslung it now, and then redonned the cloak. Waiting for another cloud shadow to cross the hill, she rose slowly to her feet and crouched at the uphill edge of the track, waiting to see if there was any outcry or any sign that she had been spotted. Silence. She reached into her quiver and selected the arrow she had prepared specially that afternoon. It had a 10-centimeter length of white ribbon attached just ahead of the nock. She set the arrow on the string, and, making sure the ribbon could run freely, stood up, drew, aimed, and released. The arrow hissed away from the bow, the white ribbon streaming out behind it. As she had remarked earlier, shooting uphill in poor light made ranging uncertain. The ribbon arrow was a way of checking the distance and the elevation she'd need. The ribbon was too light to cause any real resistance, so it wouldn't affect the flight of the arrow. But when it struck the timbers of the hill fort, the strip of white would be visible, hanging down from the shaft and showing her where her shot had fallen. Just to make sure, she had prepared 2 ranging arrows, but now she saw she wouldn't need the second. Her first shot had hit the palisade, almost 2 meters below the rim. She could see the white strip of ribbon against the dark bulk of the fort. It fluttered sideways in the light breeze, the movement making it easier to see. The range had been fractionally longer than she'd estimated. Now she took her message arrow from the quiver and nocked it. Drawing back, she adjusted her aiming point to send this arrow a little higher than the first, then released. This time, the arrow struck the palisade just below the rim. She nodded, satisfied. It should be visible there the following morning, she thought. She dropped into a crouch once more. Time to get going, she muttered to herself. And that is going to be the end of Chapter 12. Thank you all for listening, and I will see you next time in Chapter 13. God bless, and have a good one.